Hey everyone, Mr. Tweet here. So in this graph, I'm going to be going over barriers to trade and how we show those on a graph in economics. So what I have here, I know this looks kind of confusing, but to begin with, it's just a unit to supply and demand graph to start with. So you can see that I've got supply to the sky, demand to the dirt, and my price and my quantity here. So all of the elements of that unit to market are all shown. Now this supply curve and this demand curve, those are the domestic curves for our market. So in this example, I'm using avocados. So the supply and demand curve that you see are, the word domestic means like within the country. So if we didn't trade with anyone, if this country blocked off their walls, refused to trade with anyone, the supply curve that you see here would be the supply that we'd have of avocados, and the demand curve would be right here. And what you would get is you get this equilibrium, just like unit 2, where this would be the price domestically, and then this would be the quantity that people would consume. So right here, I got red dots would be what would happen if we had no trade at all, if we had complete barriers to trade. Now, typically when we see barriers to trade, usually it doesn't stop trade altogether. Sometimes it does, but usually when countries put up barriers, usually what they try to do is they just try to slow the import of foreign goods. So we call things like this would be like a tariff or a quota. A tariff is a tax on things from other countries to make them more expensive. A quota is a limit on the quantity of things from another country to make fewer of them to make them more expensive. So in both cases, what you get is the quota or the tariff make goods from other countries cheap, more expensive. So on our graph right here, you see these two horizontal lines. The bottom one is our global price. So that like the idea is, if we looked at the entire world on a totally separate supply and demand graph where we had all of the supply in the world and all of the demand in the world, we would get our own unique global equilibrium price for this thing, and it might be lower. So if like other countries can produce avocados cheaper, maybe they have like more water, or their water is cheaper, or maybe their workers are cheaper, so that allows them, or maybe they're able to access fertilizer cheaper so that they're able to produce avocados at a lower price, right? So maybe some other countries it's also more expensive. So based on all the supply, all the demand in the world, you get a global market with an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Now, remember what equilibrium means. Equilibrium means that everybody who wants to consume at that price can consume, and everybody who wants to produce at that price can produce. So that means if you're a consumer and you're willing to pay the equilibrium price, there's enough quantity out there for whatever it is that you want, right? That's by definition, that's what equilibrium means. So we express that global equilibrium as a horizontal line at that global price, right? So that if this was like the domestic price for avocados is say $1 each, then there might be, right, and as many as you want globally, you can get for 50 cents. That's based on the global supply and demand. This is the price that's available all the way, whatever quantity is that you want, because you're part of that supply and demand curve. So what this graph shows us is that if this country was to have totally free trade, right, they were able to allow avocados to freely enter into their country, then what we would see is where the demand curve, I'm going to add S's here, because it's really what you see there is really the global supply curve. And then I'll talk about this other one in a minute. But if we had total free trade, this is where my global supply would intersect my domestic demand. And so at this quantity out here, that's the quantity that people would consume. Now, at that price, whatever this is, like I said, for avocados, if this is 50 cents, my domestic supply would be very low. So what we see when we have free trade is that the domestic producers, they don't produce as much. The quantity supplied went from QD down to Q1, right? Because some of those avocado businesses farms are going to go out of business because they can't produce avocados at 50 cents, but some of them can. Some of them can produce avocados at 50 cents, and so they'll stay in business, and they're still producing some of our quantity. But a large part of our quantity is imported because other people can do it cheaper, so we bring that in, and then we trade them something else that we can do better. So the quantity consumed would be Q4, the quantity produced would be Q1. Now, when we have free trade, oftentimes domestic producers, they're not going to like this, because if you're a domestic producer, right, when we have trade, you're producing a lot less and you're collecting a lower price. You're getting this price instead of this price. So oftentimes what domestic producers do is they will push government officials, or they'll lobby government officials to protect them from foreign trade. And so what that protection oftentimes looks like is we put a tax on avocados coming from other countries. So now they don't have to compete against 50-cent avocados. Now they're competing against 75-cent avocados, right? And if it's 75-cent avocados, then that means that they're going to be able to produce, they're going to be more profitable. So whether it's a quota, which is whether it's a limit of quantity, or whether it's a limit on price, a tariff, either way, what it does is it has the effect of shifting up the global supply, right? So that this, you still have an unlimited supply available, but it's at a higher price. Or in the fact of a quota, what we've done is we've limited the amount coming in, so that establishes a newer, higher baseline. So whenever we have a tariff or a quota, it creates this higher price up here. What that does at this higher price is it means we're going to have this quantity right here at that price. That's our quantity demanded. So consumers are going to buy Q3, and producers are going to produce at that quantity right there. They're going to produce Q2 right there. So what we see are barriers to trade. What they do is they cause prices to go up from here to here, which means consumers pay a higher price, so we don't consume as much. But it also means that producers are able to charge a higher price, so we get more domestic production. So what would happen in our avocado example is we would see avocado farms would spring up. We'd have a higher production level of avocados because of that higher price, but our consumers are not going to consume as many avocados because they're now paying an artificially high price of 75 cents instead of 50 cents. Now, again, this all compares to what there would be if there was no trade. That if there was no trade, consumers would consume even less, producers would produce even more, and so we would see even a bigger benefit to those producers at the expense of consumers. So this is our graph right here. Something that's often commonly done with this graph is we would look at consumer and producer surplus. So if you remember consumer surplus, this is a review back from unit 2. Consumer surplus is the area in between the demand curve and whatever your horizontal price line is. So consumer surplus is between price and demand. Producer surplus is the difference between, it's the area between price and our supply curve. That's where our producer surplus is found. So we can use our surplus to analyze this to see what happens in this marketplace. So for instance, if we want to know what's the consumer surplus when we have free trade and what's our producer surplus, well, our consumer surplus when we have free trade is it's going to be above my price line all the way to my demand curve. So this whole thing here, that's all consumer surplus when we have free trade. Lots of consumers benefiting from cheap foreign products, right? Cheap avocados in this instance. My producer surplus is going to be below price and above my domestic supply. So that's my producer surplus when we have a free trade. Now, when we establish a barrier to trade, like a quota or a tariff, what that does is it moves the price from here to here. And so what we get now This is my increase in producer surplus. My consumer surplus is a lot smaller. And then we also have this area right here in the middle that used to be surplus, that's not surplus anymore. We call that deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is area that, because of our intervention in the marketplace, what we've done is we've caused people to not benefit as much as they could. And so this is the lost efficiency or lost benefit in that marketplace. So this is, again, this is the model we use when we have either a quota or a tariff on foreign trade. We can use this to see what happens. Our domestic producers benefit because their surplus gets bigger. Our domestic consumers are hurt because their surplus gets smaller. And overall, it leads to an inefficient use of resources. That's the green part we see right there that we call deadweight loss. So anyways, that's tariffs, quotas, barriers to trade. Have a good one.